My guest is the man who's enhanced my ability to marvel at the influence of the Christian faith in history through the reading of Who is This Man? The Unpredictable Impact of the Inescapable Jesus. The author, John Ortberg, is a senior pastor at Menlo Park Presbyterian Church. He has a degree in psychology, PhD, nonetheless, at clinical psychology. And I didn't mention this last time. John, a prominent voice in the worldwide spiritual formation movement. Speak to us about that.
You know, the phrase spiritual formation is getting more and more popular. It really is a very simple thing. Easiest way I know to explain it is there's an outer you and there's an inner you. The outer you is being shaped all the time, for better or worse, intentionally or not, what you eat, how you exercise, it's getting formed. And there's an inner you. The inner you is your thoughts, your desires, your emotions. That also is getting formed. You are receiving a spiritual formation. So spiritual formation has to do with how is someone growing or being shaped spiritually. It's not something that's an optional activity for certain people inside the church. Everybody is receiving a spiritual formation. When you watch TV, when you sit in front of a computer, when you talk to people, that inner you is being shaped.
And we're all spiritual beings.
Everybody is inevitably, inescapably. And part of the power of Jesus is he spoke to the Spirit more powerfully than anybody else ever has.
You're in a part of the world that is somewhat resistant, at least has a reputation for being such.
Yeah.
And I'm sure your background in psychology gives you a lot of wisdom in just how to approach people. You're presenting the historic Christ and opening our eyes to his influence in ways most Christians don't know.
Yeah. Yep. Where I live in the Bay Area, you know, the huge majority of folks are not churched, and many of them, kind of like Europe and I think like parts of Canada, almost consider Christianity just to be a post option. It's like, you know, thoughtful people don't even consider it. And so helping people look again at Jesus and to say, you know what, everybody's got to learn how to live from somebody. If it's not going to be Jesus, who's it going to be? Who's your number two choice? And to help people get past all of the myths and misunderstandings of the Christian faith, to look actually at Jesus and just contrast him with any other person, any other philosophy, any other idea, and then allow the best ideas to prevail. And Jesus does real well at that.
A poor carpenter's son, humanly speaking. Yeah. And has there been a greater revolution in all of history? Well,
one of the striking things that the book gets into some is even in the first century, when there's just a tiny handful of followers, John says in the book of Revelation that Jesus is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And the idea of that is, it sounds like this kind of nice phrase, that take all the kings, all the prime ministers, all of the presidents, put them in a room, and Jesus rules over them all. And in that day, that just would have been a ludicrous sounding idea. And yet here we are today, 2,000 years later, and if you're to ask who's the most influential person in history, whose birthday is most widely celebrated, whose instrument of death is the most famous symbol of all time, who's had the biggest impact, he's number one and there's no number two. Nobody else comes close.
I have to tell you something that my husband shared from a conference in Zambia, Africa, where Bill Hybels was speaking. Mm-hmm. He said, you frustrate him, and he's just a little envious of how quickly you are able to put together a compelling message. I don't think this was put together quickly, though.
Well,
this had to be a lot of research.
It was an awful lot of time and an awful lot of writing, and yeah, it's the most research for any of the writing that I've done. But I have to tell you, Moira, of any books that I have written, I felt a deeper sense of calling around this one and a greater sense of joy and fulfillment in it, because it was like a devotional activity. I would often find myself when I was reading it and thinking about it and looking at how institutions like education are different, or medicine are different, or the way that we think about time is different. And I would just find myself saying, oh God, thank you for Jesus, this guy who I think I've known, that I've always heard about, and you never get to. The early church fathers used to say the gospel of Jesus is like a river that is shallow enough that a gnat can wade in it, but deep enough that an elephant can drown.
Absolutely.
And Jesus is that way.
I think this quote from Mark Nelson kind of sums up what we were highlighting yesterday. If you ask what is Jesus' influence on medicine and compassion, I would suggest that wherever you have an institution of self-giving for the lonely and for practical welfare of the lonely, schools, hospitals, hospices, orphanages for those who will never be able to repay, this probably has its roots in the movement of Jesus.
Yep. Yeah, the book gets into that much more deeply, but most people in our culture just have no idea, and we take those institutions for granted.
Because we've lived in this Judeo-Christian culture.
In the ancient world, people that had a lot of money, they might build parks or statues or monuments to themselves. There was actually a movement called monumentalism. But the idea of creating institutions sheerly for the sake of those who would never be able to pay back, that was not around in the culture until this movement grew from folks who remembered that they followed a man who said, whatever you have done for the least of these, you have done for me. And that notion of the value of the least of these simply did not exist in the ancient world.
I'm looking for the number. Was it an estimated 400,000 babies died as a result of a practice called exposure? Just leaving them to die.
In the ancient world, nobody knows exactly the numbers, but it's staggering. And even some of the findings that archaeologists have, they'll just talk about, it's kind of wrenching to look at. In particular, little baby girls. It's estimated, again, Ronnie Stark says that for about every 1.3 or 4 million boys in the ancient world, there were 1 million girls. And when you ask, where's the other 300,000 or 400,000 girls?
Yes.
They were left to die of exposure because they were the wrong gender. And again, this is not something that folks were embarrassed about. That's just, there's a letter from a soldier to his wife. It's a very tender, affectionate letter. And he says, you know, I could never forget you. I'll always love you. Take good care of our little boy. When the baby is born, if it's a girl, expose it. And beyond that, many children were sold into slavery that often involved intense forms of what we would look at now as sexual abuse. Jesus' impact on children was so strong. There's a Norwegian scholar named Bakke who wrote a book called When Children Became People, The Influence of Christianity on Childhood.
So much more of exactly this in the book. But I want to turn to the pastor now. One of the portions I enjoyed the most was where you talked about Easter, the familiar story. We know about Good Friday, lots of sermons on Good Friday, and of course Easter Sunday, the resurrection. But who preaches on Saturday?
Yeah.
Talk to us about Saturday in our lives.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite chapters in the book, and one that a lot of folks who are listening to us now will be able to relate to this. You know, Friday's the day that everything fell apart. Sunday was the day that everything got vindicated and saved. There's that theme of the 3-day story of God delivering in the Bible is a real common one. The big question is, if there's 2 parts to it, why isn't it just 2 days? Just die one day, get resurrected the next day.
Just get
What's
it done.
the deal with that middle day? And the idea is, you never know if you're in a 3rd-day story. You know, 3rd-day story means God's going to deliver you. God's going to rescue. A lot of folks listening to us right now, they don't have a job, they're sick, they're going through a divorce, and they wonder, will God ever save me? Well, the 3rd day was the day when God saved. Problem is, when it's the 2nd day, you don't know if it's a 3rd-day story. On the 2nd day, it may just be
and then
a 2-day story,
day.
that you suffer forever. And what's amazing is Jesus himself goes through that. Jesus enters into our Saturdays. The old ancient creed said that Jesus descended into hell, that hell of human suffering, of human aloneness, of feeling abandoned by the Father. Jesus himself is there, and what that means is, if you're in a Saturday, Jesus knows right where you are. And in fact, it's possible on Saturday for you to know Jesus in a way that you'll never know him on any other day, because on Saturday you know, like you never know on another day, that Jesus is our only hope. And that's true for all of us.
I don't know if it's ever been as unstable, uncertain. The world's in a real tough place. But you wrap up the book with the wonderful picture of heaven coming to earth, not someday, but in us. Pastor, talk to us about that.
I have a very good friend and a mentor for me who's going through a very difficult time, diagnosis of a disease that's about as serious as it can get. And it's so interesting, Maura. It's like watching somebody who is an advanced scout on a frontier where we're all going to go. And that is the kingdom of God. That's the presence and the reality of God. And the good news that Jesus brings that no one else has ever brought is that in this man, in this Jesus, what every human being aches for, which again, so often in the church as Christians we get wrong, we trivialize it, we legalize it, we make it small, but it's the redemption of creation. It is for life, our minds, our bodies, our relationships, our cities, our learning, our art, our love to be set right. That all of that is somehow not only real, but become present to the world in his body, in his life. And he said it, and what's amazing is he was exactly right. I mean, it's 2,000 years later. Who else is still impacting things the way that he did? And anybody who's listening to us right now who wants to can experience grace, forgiveness, and enter into that reality, that realm, that way of life that has a hope beyond death.
Wonderful words. Eternal truth. And John, I can't let you go without saying that you are husband, father. I think a lot of your compassion comes from having been a dad for some time. How old are your children?
We have 3 kids, Laura, Mallory, and Johnny, and they are 27, 25, 23. And Laura's married to Zach, who's a wonderful guy, so he's like number 4.
Still waiting to become grandpa.
You know, that's a topic that we talk about every once in a while, but I don't want to rush anybody, but I'll be ready when that day comes.
It has been a joy to have this time with you. Thank you so very much. And keep writing.
That's an honor. Thank you. I will.
This book is at our e-store. Who is this man? The unpredictable impact of the inescapable Jesus. You will be so much more grateful to be in God's forever family, to be a Christ one, when you get a handle on the history that you might have missed. John, thanks again.
Thank you for having me on.